Welcome to Let's Learn Economic Evaluation, brought to you by the Centre for Health Economics at the University of York. In this episode, we will look at the NICE cost-effectiveness threshold, a term that often appears in mainstream media when the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence makes a judgment about whether or not to approve a new medication for purchase by the NHS. But what even is it, and how is it used to make important decisions about the availability of new medication? Let's start by talking about displacement, which is the key to understanding what the NICE threshold is. To define it, let's imagine we have a child buying sweets. Each week, Tom spends his 10p of pocket money on a range of 1p sweets. One week, a new ice cream comes on sale, and he decides he wants to buy it, even though it costs 2p. To afford it, he has to not only stop buying the ice cream he usually buys, but also one of the other sweets, as his 10p pocket money is fixed, and the new ice cream more expensive. He buys the new ice cream as he will get more enjoyment from it than the other ice cream, but because it costs more, he also has to think about the other sweet that he can't afford anymore. We can say the sweet he no longer buys has been displaced by the new ice cream. The idea of displacement is easy to understand in such a simple example. However, as we move away from sweets towards healthcare and budgets go from 10p to billions, it becomes harder to identify what is displaced. Enough talk of sweets, let's get back to health and the NHS. Rather than looking at Tom, let's consider Dr. NHS. He represents everything the NHS does, every GP appointment, every surgery, everything. So he's very busy. Obviously, the NHS doesn't really do sweets, other than the odd placebo pill. The NHS spends all of their pocket money on anything that improves the health of the population, medicines, machines, all sorts. Finally, the NHS's pocket money doesn't come from their mum, but from the government. But just as with the boys, they have no influence on how much they're given. Their pocket money is also a little bit more than 10p a week, getting somewhere in the region of £100 billion from the UK government each year. Other than that, the NHS is very similar to Tom buying sweets. They both face a budget constraint, neither control how much their budget is, and they both want the most for their money, and as a result have to consider the impact of anything new they buy on their current practice. To help us understand the idea of displacement in the NHS, we first need to understand what the NHS actually does. In the simplest possible terms, the population of any country has a level of health, symbolised by this pile of hearts. It doesn't matter what each heart represents. It could be life expectancy of the population, their quality of life, or any other way of measuring health. In providing healthcare, we can say that the NHS improves population health. For all of its critics, nobody would say that it doesn't do anything to improve population health at all. In addition, just as the amount of pocket money given to Tom impacts how many sweets he can buy and therefore how much enjoyment he gets from eating sweets, the NHS budget impacts how much healthcare they can provide and therefore how much they improve total population health. One implication of this simplified link between NHS funding and population health is that an increase in the NHS budget would be expected to increase population health. And similarly, a decrease in the budget will reduce population health. The limited budget available to the NHS presents one core problem, characterised perfectly by the famous health economist Alan Williams, who once said, "There are far more potentially beneficial healthcare activities than any country can afford. Therefore, some potentially beneficial healthcare activities have to be withheld." This very simple point is what underlines the role of NICE. NICE is tasked with, among other things, producing guidance for the NHS on the use of health technologies. Many pharmaceutical companies want to sell their new treatments to the NHS, which are often very expensive. So the role of NICE is to decide which of these new treatments are worth doing, or in jargon, are cost effective. Simply, is the cost worth the positive effect on population health? If NICE approves a new treatment, the NHS is obliged to provide sufficient funding for it. NICE's decision can be characterised as two hurdles. Firstly, the new treatment has to be better than the current treatment. We won't worry here about what better actually means, but essentially, if it improves population health by more than the current practice, it is better than it. Secondly, if the new treatment is more expensive than the current treatment, and this is usually the case, then the additional cost must be worth the NHS bearing. This second hurdle is where the idea of displacement and the NICE threshold appears. If a new treatment clears both hurdles and is cleared by NICE for use, then, as the NHS is obliged to provide the new treatment, the NHS budget for all other services is in effect being reduced to buy the new treatment. A reduction in the budget available for all other services will have the same effect as we saw when the NHS budget was decreased. Less healthcare provision and so less population health. NICE knows that every additional cost they place on the NHS by approving a new, more expensive treatment forces some other area of NHS activity to be stopped. This is essentially the definition of the threshold, which is the additional cost needed to displace one unit of population health from elsewhere in the NHS. So the threshold is the additional cost that must be placed on the NHS to displace one unit of health. This value is used by NICE to inform how good a new treatment must be to justify its additional cost to the NHS. Let's run through an example to show the use of the threshold. NICE is asked to evaluate a new treatment, let's say for lung cancer. The drug is found to improve population health by 3 hearts, compared to if no treatment was provided, at a cost of 2 notes. We're avoiding real money, as this is a complete example, not indicative of actual practice. The new treatment has an equivalent treatment currently used by the NHS that treats exactly the same form of lung cancer in the same population. It's not as good, only improving population health by 1 heart, but only costing 1 note. So, the first hurdle. A simple comparison concludes that the new treatment is better than the current by 2 hearts of population health. But as it costs 1 note more, we must go to the second hurdle, which considers if the NHS activity displaced by the additional cost would be worthwhile. We know that the new treatment is associated with an additional 2 hearts compared to the current treatment, at an additional cost of 1 note. Similarly, we saw earlier that for every note of extra cost placed on the NHS, 1 heart was displaced, i.e. the threshold is 1 note per heart. So we can see that overall, using the new treatment will leave us 1 heart of population health better off. This example shows that while the new treatment was 2 hearts better than the current treatment, if we take into account what is displaced, i.e. the threshold, then we actually are only gaining 1 heart overall. There are some common misconceptions about the threshold that need to be raised and may have sprung to mind during this episode. Firstly, the threshold is not an estimate of our willingness to pay for health. It is often argued that NICE's decision should be based on what we, as a society, should be willing to pay for the health produced by the NHS. This idea misunderstands the role of the NICE threshold. It is not the starting point for decisions around how much funding the NHS should receive, but a way of accounting for displacement in the NHS. As neither NICE or the NHS decide their budget, it would be inappropriate for them to decide the threshold. As such, NICE have been characterised as a threshold searcher, not a threshold setter. Any decision to adjust the threshold so it closer reflects social values for health would require a change to taxation or wider government spending, a much more complicated decision than whether we think we value life more than we currently spend improving it. Secondly, it is important to understand what the threshold estimate represents. It is not an estimate of the average cost of what is done by the NHS to improve health. This is because it is what is displaced, so is likely to be less valuable than what is done on average by the NHS. Neither is it an estimate of the value of a specific displaced activity. In an ideal world this may be the case, however it is unfeasible to identify exactly what will be displaced before a decision is made, so the threshold is an estimate. And finally, it is not an estimate of the least cost-effective activity, as not only can we not realistically know out of everything the NHS does what is the least cost-effective, but importantly, it is not cost-effectiveness alone that decides what is displaced. Many other factors such as equity of care and contract requirements play a role. It is simply an estimate of the average value of what, in the real world in which the NHS operates, is displaced by an additional cost borne by the NHS. Thank you for watching this episode exploring the NICE cost-effectiveness threshold, brought to you by the Centre for Health Economics at the University of York.